Welcome to Business Talk Sister Gawk. I'm Becca, and today's podcast episode topic is what the FEMA is going on. And this podcast episode actually is coming to you after quite a significant break I've had in podcasting. And part of that is because I personally have been experiencing the repercussions of a FEMA national disaster within the region that I live. And for the record, it is nothing in comparison to what's been happening with other parts of the United States in regards to North Carolina's flooding and water damage, as well as what's happening in California with the wildfires. So I'm so thankful for what we have and what we could have lost. So I'm just so grateful. But at the same time, it has put a damper on a lot of things because I've just been in the midst of so much trying to recover from that. Just personally with our whole house and also with some damage that's happened to my business. And I'm going to give you a little caveat today. Everything I recommend in this podcast or in this series, because I have a feeling it's going to be longer than one podcast, is my personal opinion. And I'm asking to be held blameless in the event you take my advice. I'm just a business owner, so that's my disclaimer. But here we go. A bit of background about FEMA and its changes under different administrations. Honestly, I'm going to give you some of this information based on my memory of a research paper I did on FEMA during a change management class I took in probably 2011. So if you're wondering all the real nitty-gritty details, definitely give it a bit more research. And forgive me if my information is not as specific enough as you want, because I want to make sure to give it at least justice and accuracy. And I know I could get down into like names of locations and whatever, but I don't have all the information in front of me. And quite honestly, it's been so long since I put out a podcast. I really didn't have the time to dig back into all of that. So I'm just going to give you a brief background. And by brief, I mean the brief version for me because I'm a nerd. So during 9/11 and the attack on the Twin Towers and our nation's capital, FEMA was called in to support the efforts. However, there was a big scare regarding the fact that volunteers could become pretenders and actually radical extremists and be disguised and come help but end up creating more hurt. And so they were very concerned that more damage could be done because, this was a massive thing. And there's a really interesting phenomena about 9/11 where the majority of people who are alive and experience that traumatic event in the United States actually remember exactly where they were when they found out about that attack. And so after 9/11, FEMA was overhauled by the Department of Homeland Security, and it was placed under the direction of the Department of Homeland Security. So that was a really big crisis. They wanted to make sure that they looked at everything, how volunteers were vetted, all of that, because they didn't want to add more chaos to the chaos that was there. And so that happened. And then the next big calamity that really happened in the United States was Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And prior to that hurricane that just decimated New Orleans due to the levee system not being able to withstand the force of the hurricane, there actually was a meeting FEMA had with the city of New Orleans where they did a crisis simulation of a hurricane of pretty much the exact same size, hitting the city and destroying the levee system. And during that training, they had an entire packet for the crisis plan of information regarding the duties of the city of New Orleans for their boots on the ground efforts during the crisis response, and then clear directives that FEMA was going to follow up with as soon as they could get the resources in place to that area of the United States. Now, the plan was that the city of New Orleans needed to handle the support with their emergency workers and always have, in case this ever arose, they should have on hand enough food and water to support the city for 3 days. That would be enough time for FEMA to disperse all of the people they needed to that part of the nation to get there to come and do all of the services that they need to do to support the crisis management. And so FEMA was said, after 3 days, we'll come in, we'll handle the rest. You guys cover the first 3 days. Unfortunately, what happened during that time in the restructuring that the Department of Homeland Security did, they didn't actually look at the organizational hierarchy of FEMA and who was allowed to approve what. This ended in a massive round loop of people who had no idea who was responsible to approve things during the midst of a crisis. And that was a big problem because there was no real hierarchy of here's who's allowed to say yes or no to this decision. And the sad part of all this is that when the food and water ran out, the support needed was supposed to change hands to FEMA. But FEMA wasn't ready, and FEMA didn't show up in the way that they said that they would. And this really started to make the city of New Orleans panic. And honestly, people started to die. Additionally, anyone who signed up to volunteer with the Red Cross or any humanitarian aid organization because of 9/11, there was this massive desire to have everyone be background checked and cleared for service. Now, this was a huge bottleneck because the background checks were not coming back fast enough. And this meant that somewhere there was an office that was reviewing everything to see if someone was an undercover terrorist, but they weren't approved to go serve and help in the volunteer efforts. So people from all over the United States with food and water and supplies were showing up to help New Orleans. And the National Guard, along with other departments, were being told to turn them away in droves because none of them had been cleared as safe people that were there to help the recovery efforts. So people were getting so frustrated individually that finally people became rogue. And, I would say they were a lot of backcountry vigilantes that started bringing down their own boats and just going to rescue people off the top of the roofs and out of dangerous areas. They weren't asking permission. They weren't caring if they were getting chased down by the National Guard or the Coast Guard or whoever. They just went for it to save people's lives. And this was a massive calamity. I remember listening to even some documentation from NPR where they actually put it in their series of greatest hits or whatever in one of their documentaries. Don't quote me on the exact album of release that they did, but one of the things was actually a report from, I believe, Robert Siegel, where he did a little documentary piece beforehand of while he was interviewing someone, like they had no idea that there were more people at another location being gathered without food and water. And even the people in charge had no idea of that second location. And so it was terrifying even to the reporters as they were investigating the story of what was actually happening on the ground. Now, this was a massive calamity. Once the actual level of damage and need was assessed, heads were starting to roll at FEMA during this time. Lots of restructuring happened post Hurricane Katrina. And when Superstorm Sandy, which was the next pretty big event, came and hit the East Coast, that was the next big one, FEMA showed up in an organized way. And finally, it looked like it was really taking a turn for the positive. However, the level of devastation really just wasn't to the same scale as Hurricane Katrina. So with more recent events, such as the North Carolina flooding and the California wildfires, there's a lot of questions for me, as well as other people, on what to do when you have a business and you are affected by natural disaster. Now, I would say that, like I said before, my personal experiences are not to the level of damage that were happening in other parts of the United States later in the year of 2024. But I do think that there's some things that I've learned that I'd like to share with you, because as I was looking for information for myself, as well as trying to understand what's happening across the United States, there really wasn't a lot of resources available. I remember posting in small business support groups, asking questions, and there was a resounding silence, shockingly, on what to do to prepare for, as well as to address damage after a natural disaster for a small business. And that really prompted me to really dig in personally to understand everything myself as I went through the process. What better opportunity to make a research study, right? As well as understand what the options are. So here's a little bit about what I've learned. The majority of resources available for FEMA response are actually focused on the homeowner as well as individuals and their families affected by a natural disaster. And personally, I think as they should be, right? Because it affects everybody. And really, what is the percentage of small business owners in the United States comparatively to the entire population? It's really not proportional. So I can definitely see why the resources are more directed at the family. And so with that being said, FEMA does help homeowners and has a loan funding access for that if you need to rebuild. They also have a lot of assistance money to help with hotels, or if you need a place to stay while your home is being fixed or rebuilt. And they can pay for a bit of your personal property loss too. But in all honesty, it's not a lot. And with the amount of devastation that some things have, especially with like insurance claims or whatever else, it really doesn't cover much to help you get back on your feet. And it's a bit sad how much of it is really just you experiencing loss and not having a whole lot of compensation to go forward. And I mean, do I think there could be more stuff there? Maybe. But the reality is, when it comes to business and FEMA with the Small Business Administration and everything, there really are not a whole lot of options available. And you would think, well, why not? But there just really aren't. So let's just talk a little bit about what is available. So I will say, and some of you may know this, that I have been going through the process of building a building, which I'm going to do an update on in the future. But I have finished products and inventory that I was holding in my house in the crawl space. And part of the flooding and damage that we had, there was quite a bit of seeping is a different category than flooding, by the way, but it does count towards issues in a FEMA emergency, even if your home is not flooded. A seepage through any of the walls or anything else that causes entire spaces to be molded, etc., do count as part of the damage for a property. So what I found is specifically finished products, if you have retail or whatever, and they get molded and completely destroyed, FEMA's not going to cover any of that, really. They will only cover compensation for tools needed to get your work done if you're a small business owner. But the interesting thing is that they will only cover tools to get your work done if they were stored on your personal property for your home. Anything that's destroyed at your business is not covered, which is very interesting. And unfortunately, when we kind of went through the process for our family, I was not home at the time, and I didn't find out about the tool coverage until later when an additional FEMA response person called me on the phone. Now, I will say that their phone response is actually pretty impressive for how many times they call you. They try to encourage you to file and talk with somebody, have a representative come out, and they are actually very, very helpful in that way. And I think that FEMA does actually do a pretty good job in trying to encourage people to get the support, even if they think they don't need it. And one of the things they specifically said is if you think that there was more there that wasn't covered when they came through or whatever, you have a certain amount of time, I believe it's like 90 days, but it could be 60, so don't quote me on that, to file a appeal and say, hey, can you please evaluate this? I had more damage here that wasn't reviewed. So there is an appeal process. You can do that by mail, or you can also, I believe there's an online portal you can log into as well to submit those papers and make those requests. So I would highly recommend actually setting up, if you're not already part of like the Gov website kind of stuff, getting something like that set up so your login is already set to go, because there is a process for the online portal that a lot of federal agencies are all using now, but there is a verification in which you have to show them like your face or set up a meeting for somebody to verify your driver's license or whatever to make sure that you're a real person and a U.S. citizen. So there is a little bit to set up if you want to use the online portal. But I would say it's actually pretty efficient with receiving information. The one thing I will tell you, though, is that the information provided within the government portal is not the same information with the exact details that is mailed to you in the mail. So if you get anything from FEMA in the mail, save it, because you're never going to get another copy. And a lot of the stuff in the government portal will not show you the exact information on the letter that was mailed to you. And there's really no way to get a second copy unless maybe if you call and ask for one. But I do know that when you call the 1-800 number or talk to someone at the service desk asking them questions, they can read you the letter that was mailed to you, and they do have access to be able to see that much more than you can see in the portal online. So just in case you needed that information, that is available. So what does FEMA actually provide to business owners? Well, they actually are in partnership with the Small Business Administration. So FEMA doesn't actually run all of that, but the Small Business Administration does have a loan that you can take out for damages to your business. And I'm just going to read you the handout that I received just so you kind of have an idea, because I look for this all over the internet and it's not available. So, low fixed interest rate with terms up to 30 days, automatic no payments and no interest for 12 months from the date of the first disbursement. You can apply for it before your insurance is settled. You can get an unsecured loan for up to $25,000. So that means that it's not collateralized, it's unsecure, right? And then you can get up to $2 million to cover physical damage and financial losses for your business. And then there's also funds available for mitigation measures to build back better, more resilient. So that's kind of what it says is necessary. And then it says what small businesses and nonprofits need to apply for a disaster loan. Basically, what do you have to have in order to be able to start the process? You need a cell phone and a contact information. You need a social security number or your employer identification numbers for all applicants or owners associated with the application. For the business, your financial information, such as your income, account balances, monthly expenses. So they're going to want to look at all of your stuff. And then a complete copy of your most recent federal income tax return, insurance information, if available as well. So if you're filing a claim, they're going to want to know what is in the claim as well, because say you're going to get something like unsecured just to cover things in between, and then all of a sudden at the end you get your insurance check back. They're going to want to make sure that you're paying off your loan and you're using the insurance check to either pay for the loan back or whatever to make sure that they're going to get paid. So there's just a lot of stuff there to make sure that they know they have all the right information. Is it worth taking the loan? Well, that really just depends. When I looked into it for my business, I think that the max amount was around $500,000 for that mitigation funding. I'm not positive on that, but it was somewhere around there. And honestly, when they said low interest rate, when I really looked into it, I didn't think it was that low. It was a fluctuating number depending on what the market was doing, I believe at the time. But I mean, it was lower than a regular commercial loan rate, but I'm kind of used to stuff for like the EDA doing like a 3% or whatever. So to me, it was just kind of high. But the first year of the loan is interest free. Now, for some people, that is very attractive because they kind of would like to leverage that. For other people, not so much. So, I mean, that would be the benefit of the loan, is that the first year is interest free, and there may be ways to be able to utilize that to your advantage. Do you have a way to still make money right now? That would be a question I would be asking yourself before deciding if it's worth taking or looking at the loan. Because did your entire operation come to a halt due to the disaster? And do you have a way to leverage other spaces or access the goods and services you need to do your job? It may honestly be better to answer those questions first before considering whether or not you have the resources or will have the resources within a year to be able to start making that loan payment back, or be able to pay the whole loan back before the year is up where you don't have that interest rate. The other question I would say is, do you have a lot of debt currently? And the answer may be no. But the sad part about natural disasters like flooding is that most insurance companies will not include flooding as part of their policy. So you're really not covered through your insurance for a lot of the damages. And also FEMA will not cover anything for your actual business property itself. So this can be a tough lose-lose. So what businesses lose the most in a natural disaster? Well, those who just incurred a lot of debt to buy the business and its assets, or a business that has a lot of debt already and no insurance coverage for the type of claim that it has to file. So at that point, some businesses cannot afford to move forward, and the only option is to consider closing and bankruptcy. Because the reality is that if you're trying to take out another loan and it doesn't have any collateral and you already have debt on your business, this can honestly mean that you're going to be denied that loan. And it can be really tough to pay all that back with the lead time to get a cash flow going again if you do have an insurance claim that's working with you and saying they are going to cover your damages. Because quite honestly, getting back up and going is a lot more difficult than people realize, especially if you have to do a lot of construction. Because right now, as a nation, we are kind of in a trade shortage of people to do the work. So how do you even get declared a FEMA natural disaster area? That is a good question, and we're going to come back to it in the next episode. So you're definitely going to want to stick around for the next one, and I'm going to transition to the gawk portion before I close out this episode. So one of the things I wanted to share with you as a gawk about this experience that I had with all of the things happening for the flooding in our area was that the day that it happened, it was coming down so fast that all of the water was coming through two different roads and it was meeting right where my house is and coming down this hill. And I kid you not, it was not very long before all of that water that was running down this hill just ripped the entire road away, just eroded the whole thing. And I mean, I'm talking like a mini version, I would say, definitely a mini version of what happened with the flooding at Yellowstone National Park a while back, where that road was just completely destroyed. And if you haven't seen any of those pictures, go look at it. It's kind of incredible how fast water can shape the earth. And that was pretty crazy for our whole neighborhood. We just saw such quick efforts to rip up the whole road, and then we had to get it all patched up and make sure that nobody tripped on it and whatever. So it was just quite wild. Wow. And I don't know if any of you have ever been in the midst of a big storm or whatever and just seen how crazy the elements become. But it was quite interesting to actually witness for myself. So that's my gawk for this episode. And if you enjoyed this episode, you can give it a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And I will see you in the next episode in this series.